Could you imagine hearing your own betrayal being planned in words they think you can't understand? What if that man could hear what treaty commissioners were really saying when they thought no one understood English, and then explain to tribal leaders exactly how they were being manipulated? This wasn't just impressive. This was terrifying to those in power. Because a man who needs no interpreter can't be controlled. A man who understands what's actually being said, not what translation chooses to convey, holds power that no amount of military force can suppress. Could you imagine the political earthquakes this caused? One person who could hear every conversation, understand every negotiation, and speak directly to everyone without a single intermediary to filter meaning?
Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. This is what we do here. We dig up the frontier stories that got buried or forgotten. The moments when survival, politics, and power came down to skills that history books dismiss as footnotes. In this video, we're uncovering how linguistic mastery became political dynamite and how the people who could speak across cultures shaped the West as profoundly as any army or treaty ever did. If that kind of story interests you, hit subscribe. We've got a lot more of them. And seriously, drop a comment about what fascinates you most about frontier translation and communication. We love hearing what you're into. Now, let's walk into a council lodge in 1868, where a treaty commissioner is about to discover that he's lost control of the negotiation before it even started. The treaty commissioner's hand froze halfway to his glass. Across the council lodge, the Lakota delegation had just spoken. A long, formal statement about hunting grounds and sacred lands. Before the commissioner's interpreter could even open his mouth, the man seated near the fire responded. In Lakota, perfect, fluent, conversational Lakota that made the Lakota chiefs lean forward with interest rather than the usual stiff tolerance they showed translators. Then the Cheyenne representative interjected. The same man, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, switched languages mid-sentence, addressing the Cheyenne concern in their own tongue. No pause, no fumbling for words. The kind of fluency that only comes from thinking in a language, not translating through another one. The commissioner felt his stomach tighten. He'd brought 3 interpreters to this negotiation. He'd thought that gave him control of the conversation, control of meaning, control of what promises actually meant when words crossed between English and indigenous languages. But the man by the fire spoke 13 languages, and he was speaking directly to everyone in the room except the commissioner. For the next 4 hours, Jean-Baptiste would demonstrate something that terrified treaty commissioners, army officers, and territorial governors across the West: the political power of a man who needed no interpreter. A man who could hear what was actually being said, not what translation chose to convey. A man who understood the nuances, the untranslatable concepts, the meanings that lived between languages rather than inside them. The commissioner realized far too late that he'd lost control of this negotiation the moment Jean-Baptiste walked into the room. Because while the commissioner needed translators to speak to anyone, Jean-Baptiste could speak to everyone. That wasn't just a linguistic advantage, that was political power in its purest form. What happened in that council lodge in 1868 would reshape treaty negotiations for the next decade. But to understand how one man came to wield such extraordinary linguistic power, we need to understand what it meant to grow up between worlds in a place where language was survival, commerce, politics, and identity all at once. To understand what Jean-Baptiste knew and how he came to speak languages that took most people decades to learn, we need to understand the linguistic complexity of the northern plains and Rocky Mountains in the early 1800s. Because this wasn't a region with 2 or 3 languages. This was a linguistic landscape as complex as the terrain itself, and just as dangerous if you couldn't navigate it. The northern plains and Rocky Mountain region in the early 19th century was home to speakers of at least 5 major language families, each as different from one another as English is from Chinese. This wasn't dialectical variation. These were fundamentally different languages with unique grammar structures, sound, systems, and ways of organizing thought. The Siouan language family included Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Crow, Hidatsa, and others. The Algonquian family covered Cree, Ojibwe, Blackfoot, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. The Uto-Aztecan family brought Shoshone, Comanche, and Paiute. The Caddoan family included Pawnee and Arikara, and various smaller language families and isolates, languages with no clear relatives, filled the gaps. Kiowa stood alone. So did Kootenai. For a trader, interpreter, or diplomat operating in this region, that linguistic diversity was both opportunity and obstacle. Opportunity because someone who could bridge these languages became invaluable. To tribes, to trading companies, to military forces, to treaty commissioners. Obstacle because learning even one of these languages to true fluency could take years. Learning multiple languages from different families required not just time, but cognitive flexibility that few possessed. Most white settlers and traders never learned more than trade jargon, simplified vocabulary for basic transactions. Some military officers learned enough to give orders or understand reports. Very few white Americans ever achieved real fluency in even one Plains language. The grammar was too different. The conceptual frameworks didn't map onto English. And frankly, most whites didn't bother. They assumed interpreters would handle communication, often without understanding how much meaning could be lost or manipulated in translation. But there were people who grew up speaking multiple indigenous languages as naturally as breathing, children of mixed heritage, raised in multilingual households and communities, who heard Cree from their mother, French from their father, and picked up Lakota, Shoshone, and Crow from the trading post where everyone gathered. These children developed linguistic abilities that seemed almost magical to monolingual observers. They weren't magical. They were the natural result of growing up in a world where language diversity was normal and language acquisition was survival. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau was born into exactly this world. Born in 1805 at Fort Mandan in present-day North Dakota, he was the son of Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trader, and Sacagawea, a Lemhi Shoshone woman who would become famous as the interpreter for the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jean-Baptiste spent his first months of life strapped to his mother's back during that expedition, traveling from the Dakotas to the Pacific coast and back. The expedition journals mention him frequently. Clark nicknamed him Pomp and grew quite fond of the infant. But Jean-Baptiste's linguistic education began long before he could speak. Infants and young children absorb language patterns with an efficiency that adults can never match. The sounds, rhythms, and structures of the languages spoken around them become embedded in their developing brains in ways that shape how they process all future language learning. Jean-Baptiste heard Shoshone from his mother, French from his father, Hidatsa from the community where his parents lived at Fort Mandan, English from the Lewis and Clark Party. By the time he was old enough to form words, his brain had already mapped the sound systems and basic grammar structures of at least 4 completely different languages. This early multilingual exposure created what linguists now call metalinguistic awareness, an ability to think about language as a system rather than just a tool. Children who grow up with multiple languages develop cognitive flexibility that makes learning additional languages significantly easier. They understand intuitively that words are arbitrary labels, that grammar rules differ across languages, and that concepts might exist in one language but not another. When Jean-Baptiste was 6 years old, William Clark, who had led the expedition and developed genuine affection for the boy, offered to take responsibility for his education. Sacagawea and Toussaint agreed. Jean-Baptiste was sent to St. Louis to live with Clark and attend school. This wasn't unusual for mixed heritage children of traders. St. Louis was a multilingual city where French, English, and various indigenous languages mixed freely. The schools there prepared children for lives as interpreters, traders, or intermediaries. But Jean-Baptiste's education went far beyond basic schooling. He learned to read and write in both English and French. He studied Latin, which gave him frameworks for understanding grammatical concepts across languages. He learned mathematics, history, geography. But more importantly, he maintained connections with the indigenous communities in and around St. Louis. He didn't lose his Shoshone. He added Osage, Kansa, and Missouri to his repertoire by spending time in communities where those languages were spoken. By his teenage years, Jean-Baptiste was already operating as an interpreter for trading parties. He'd learned that languages weren't just vocabularies to memorize, they were ways of organizing reality. The Lakota language, for instance, has verb structures that emphasize the ongoing nature of actions rather than fixed states. The distinction between being and becoming that English treats as philosophical becomes grammatical in Lakota. Understanding that conceptual difference meant understanding how Lakota speakers thought about time, change, and identity. In 1823, when Jean-Baptiste was 18, he met Prince Paul of Württemberg, a German nobleman who was traveling through the American West collecting specimens and documenting indigenous cultures. Paul recognized Jean-Baptiste's extraordinary linguistic abilities and invited him to Europe. Jean-Baptiste spent the next 6 years in Europe, living in Germany and traveling across the continent. He learned German, picked up some Italian and Spanish, and was exposed to European intellectual currents that were beginning to treat language as a subject worthy of scientific study. When he returned to America in 1829, Jean-Baptiste was 24 years old and spoke at least 9 languages fluently: Shoshone, Hidatsa, French, English, German, Spanish, Crow, Lakota, and Mandan. He could understand but not speak several others, and he had something even more valuable than linguistic skill. He understood how languages worked, how translation failed, and how meaning could be preserved or manipulated depending on the interpreter's choices.
The American West in 1829 was entering a new phase. The fur trade was booming. Conflicts between indigenous nations and American expansion were intensifying, and the demand for skilled interpreters was about to explode. Jean-Baptiste returned to the upper Missouri River region and immediately found work. The American Fur Company, which dominated the Western fur trade, desperately needed interpreters who could facilitate transactions with Crow, Blackfoot, and Shoshone trappers and traders. Most company interpreters knew one or two languages. Jean-Baptiste could move between trading posts where different languages were spoken and handle negotiations that required understanding multiple tribal perspectives at once. But translation in the fur trade wasn't just about vocabulary. It was about understanding the cultural concepts embedded in economic exchange. Indigenous trading customs included protocols for gift-giving, kinship obligations, and reciprocal relationships that went far beyond simple buy-sell transactions. An interpreter who didn't understand these concepts would crash negotiations before they started. Jean-Baptiste understood. He'd been raised in trading culture. He knew that when a Crow trader offered a gift before discussing business, that wasn't a bribe or a barter item. It was establishment of relationship that made trade possible. He knew that Blackfoot traders expected certain formalities before discussing quantities and prices. He knew that Shoshone groups had different trading protocols than Lakota groups, and that treating them the same would insult both. This cultural knowledge made him far more valuable than simple linguistic skill alone. He could facilitate trades that monolingual or even bilingual interpreters would bungle. Company records from the 1830s show him repeatedly solving disputes, smoothing over misunderstandings, and opening trading relationships with groups that had been hostile to the company. His linguistic ability was the tool. His cultural fluency was what made the tool effective. But Jean-Baptiste was learning something else during these years, something that would later make him dangerous to treaty commissioners and military officers. He was learning how interpreters could manipulate meaning. Translation is never neutral. Every language contains concepts, nuances, and implications that don't transfer directly to other languages. A skilled interpreter makes choices, conscious or unconscious, about which meanings to emphasize, which to downplay, and which to omit entirely. In commercial contexts, those choices affected profit margins. In political contexts, they affected land rights, sovereignty, and survival. Jean-Baptiste watched other interpreters work. He saw French traders use interpreters who deliberately simplified indigenous objections to trading terms, making complex concerns sound like minor quibbles. He saw American Fur Company interpreters translate tribal leaders' statements in ways that made them sound more agreeable to company interests than their original words suggested. He saw military interpreters frame indigenous statements in ways that justified force or made negotiations seem pointless. None of this was new. Interpreters had been manipulating meaning since languages first came into contact. But Jean-Baptiste's unique position, speaking so many languages himself, let him see the manipulation happening in real time. He could hear what was actually said, then hear what the interpreter claimed was said, and recognize the gap between them. This created an ethical dilemma that would follow him throughout his career. When he interpreted, whose interests was he serving? The person paying him? The person speaking? Some abstract ideal of accuracy? There were no simple answers. Every act of interpretation required choosing what to preserve and what to sacrifice in the transfer between languages. The 1830s brought increasing conflict to the plains. As American expansion pushed westward, indigenous nations found themselves under pressure from multiple directions. Settler movement along emigrant trails disrupted buffalo hunting grounds. Diseases spread from trading posts. Competing indigenous nations jockeyed for position in relation to American and European powers. And the U.S. government began pursuing treaties that would, in theory, establish clear boundaries and peaceful relations. In practice, treaty negotiations were linguistic and political nightmares. Treaty commissioners arrived with English-language documents full of legal terminology that had no equivalents in most indigenous languages. Concepts like sovereignty, cession, annuity, and reservation were embedded in European legal frameworks that assumed certain ideas about land ownership, political authority, and territorial boundaries that didn't map onto indigenous political systems. Interpreters at these negotiations faced impossible tasks. How do you translate sovereignty into Lakota when Lakota political systems are built on consensus rather than centralized authority? How do you explain land cession to Crow leaders when Crow concepts of land use are about access rights and seasonal patterns rather than ownership? How do you convey reservation in Shoshone when the concept of permanent boundaries contradicts seasonal mobility that's been practiced for generations? Most interpreters didn't even try for accuracy. They gave rough approximations, relied on trade jargon, or simply told tribal leaders that the treaty said things it didn't actually say. Treaty commissioners often didn't care. They wanted signatures on documents that could be presented to Congress as evidence of peaceful land transfer. Whether the signers actually understood what they were signing was, in many commissioners' views, beside the point. Jean-Baptiste attended his first major treaty negotiation in 1835 at a council between various Crow bands and American treaty commissioners near the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. He was there as an interpreter for the American Fur Company, which had interests in maintaining stable trading relationships with Crow groups. The lead commissioner had brought his own interpreter, a man who spoke passable Crow but had no deep cultural knowledge and tended to simplify everything into trade language approximations. When the Crow leaders began raising concerns about the treaty's implications for their access to traditional hunting grounds, the commissioner's interpreter translated their lengthy, nuanced statements as simple resistance to change. Jean-Baptiste, sitting quietly in the back of the council lodge, could hear exactly what was being said. The Crow leaders weren't resisting all change. They were trying to explain complex seasonal patterns, shared hunting territories with other tribes, and the importance of flexibility in how land was used versus fixed boundaries. They were making sophisticated political arguments about how the treaty would create conflicts with their neighbors and undermine their ability to maintain alliances. None of this was getting through. Finally, one of the Crow chiefs stopped talking to the commissioner and turned directly to Jean-Baptiste. In Crow, he asked, "Does the commissioner understand what I'm saying? Or is his interpreter changing my words?" The council lodge went silent. The commissioner's interpreter looked furious. He'd been called out. The commissioner looked confused. He didn't speak Crow and hadn't understood the question. And Jean-Baptiste faced a choice that defined the rest of his career. He could support the official interpreter, maintain good relations with the commission, and let the treaty proceed with its mistranslations. Or he could answer honestly and throw the entire negotiation into chaos. Jean-Baptiste stood and addressed the Crow chief in Crow. "Your words are not reaching him as you speak them. The interpreter is shortening what you say and removing your reasons." The chief nodded slowly, as if suspecting this was the case. Then he turned to the commissioner and, through Jean-Baptiste, demanded a new interpreter or the suspension of negotiations. The next 2 hours were tense. The commissioner threatened to leave. The Crow leaders threatened to refuse any treaty without proper interpretation. Eventually, Jean-Baptiste was asked by both parties to serve as primary interpreter for the remainder of the council. He agreed, but only if both sides understood that he would translate accurately, even when accuracy was inconvenient for either party. What followed was a genuine negotiation, possibly one of the few genuine treaty negotiations in this era of American expansion. The Crow leaders explained their concerns fully. The commissioner heard what they actually said and adjusted his proposals. The final treaty was still weighted in American favor. The power dynamics guaranteed that, but it at least reflected actual Crow interests rather than what the commissioner assumed those interests should be. Word of that negotiation spread quickly through both the fur trading network and government channels. Jean-Baptiste gained a reputation as an interpreter who couldn't be manipulated. Tribal leaders began requesting him specifically when treaty negotiations were scheduled. Some treaty commissioners also wanted him, believing his reputation would make tribes more willing to negotiate. Other commissioners avoided him entirely, preferring interpreters who would say whatever the commissioners wanted them to say. Over the next 15 years, Jean-Baptiste interpreted at dozens of councils, treaties, and negotiations. He added more languages to his repertoire: Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee, through immersion in communities and careful study of grammar patterns. By the mid-1840s, he was probably the most linguistically skilled interpreter operating in the Northern Plains and Rocky Mountain region. But his linguistic skill was only part of what made him effective. He understood something that most interpreters and commissioners missed. Interpretation isn't just about words. It's about concepts, cultural frameworks, and the political assumptions embedded in how languages organize reality. Take, for example, the concept of chief. English speakers use this word to translate numerous different indigenous terms for various types of leaders, each with different roles, authority, and methods of selection. A Lakota Itankan was a consensus leader whose authority came from respect and could be withdrawn if he lost that.
Respect.
A Crow Bakulawati was a war leader whose authority was specific to military contexts. A Pawnee Kasuru was a peace chief who handled diplomatic relations but had no authority in warfare. When treaty commissioners asked to speak to the chiefs, they assumed they were dealing with people who had authority to make binding decisions for their entire tribe. But many indigenous political systems didn't work that way. Leaders could speak for themselves and maybe their immediate followers, but they couldn't commit the entire nation to anything without broader consensus. And consensus building took time and process that treaty commissioners found frustrating. Interpreters who didn't understand these distinctions would translate chief without clarifying what kind of leader this was and what authority they actually had. This led to treaties signed by individuals who didn't have the political standing to commit their people to anything, and then treaty commissioners being outraged when those treaties weren't honored. Jean-Baptiste took time to explain these political structures. He'd translate a leader's statement, then add context. He speaks as a war leader, which means his authority is specific to military matters. For hunting territory questions, you'll need to consult with the Council of Elders. Or, she speaks as a woman's society leader, which in Crow culture gives her authority over agricultural lands and camp locations. The men you spoke to earlier can't make decisions about those areas without her input. This kind of interpretation was slow. It required explanation. It meant treaty councils took longer and produced more complex documents. But it also meant the treaties actually reflected what had been agreed to rather than what commissioners assumed had been agreed to. Not everyone appreciated this approach. Jean-Baptiste's insistence on accuracy made him unpopular with commissioners who wanted simple, fast negotiations that favored American interests. Some officials accused him of being too sympathetic to indigenous positions. Others suggested he was deliberately slowing negotiations to protect tribal interests at the expense of American expansion. These accusations were telling. They revealed how much treaty commissioners relied on linguistic confusion to get what they wanted. An interpreter who clarified meaning and explained cultural context made it harder to rush through treaties that tribal leaders didn't fully understand. That some officials saw accurate interpretation as obstruction shows how deeply manipulation was embedded in the treaty process. But Jean-Baptiste also frustrated some tribal leaders. His commitment to accurate interpretation meant he wouldn't soften bad news or exaggerate promises. When a treaty commissioner said something inflammatory or threatening, Jean-Baptiste translated it accurately rather than cushioning the impact. When tribal leaders made demands that the commissioner found ridiculous, Jean-Baptiste conveyed that reaction rather than pretending the commissioner was still open to negotiation. This made him trusted, but not always liked. Both sides respected that he wouldn't manipulate their words, but both sides sometimes wished he would manipulate in their favor. The late 1840s brought new complications to Jean-Baptiste's work. The Mexican-American War ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, transferring vast territories to the United States. The California Gold Rush began in 1849, sending thousands of emigrants through indigenous territories. The Oregon Trail, California Trail, and other emigrant routes crossed hunting grounds and disrupted buffalo migrations. Conflicts between indigenous nations and American settlers intensified dramatically. In this environment, the U.S. government pursued a new strategy, consolidating indigenous nations onto reservations through comprehensive treaties that would establish clear boundaries and end warfare. The massive Fort Laramie Treaty Council of 1851 aimed to bring together representatives from Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara nations to negotiate territorial boundaries and establish peace. The council required interpreters who could handle multiple languages and facilitate communication across nations that often had tense relations with each other. Jean-Baptiste was hired as one of the primary interpreters, specifically to handle Crow, Shoshone, and Lakota communications. The 1851 Fort Laramie Council was both the high point and the beginning of the end for this era of treaty-making. Over 10,000 indigenous people gathered near Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. The sheer linguistic complexity was staggering. Multiple language families were represented. Various nations had different political structures, different concepts of authority, and different priorities. Jean-Baptiste worked alongside other interpreters, each handling different language groups. But he found himself increasingly called upon to mediate not just between commissioners and tribal leaders, but between different tribal groups who couldn't communicate directly with each other. At one point during the council, a dispute broke out between Crow and Lakota representatives over hunting territory boundaries. The dispute was conducted through interpreters, Crow to Jean-Baptiste, to English to another interpreter, to Lakota, then back again. The potential for miscommunication was enormous. Territorial concepts didn't translate simply. Seasonal use rights weren't the same as permanent ownership, and both groups were trying to describe complex overlapping patterns of land use that the American commissioners couldn't conceptualize because their framework assumed exclusive ownership of defined territories. Jean-Baptiste spent hours shuttling between the two groups, translating but also explaining the conceptual frameworks each was operating under. To the Crow leaders, he explained how the Lakota thought about territorial boundaries in terms of defensive perimeters around core areas rather than exclusive control of entire regions. To the Lakota leaders, he explained how Crow concepts of land use included seasonal rights that weren't about permanent possession, but about maintaining access to resources that were only available at certain times. Eventually, the two groups worked out an understanding, not perfect, but workable. It wasn't based on European concepts of ownership. It was based on mutual recognition of seasonal patterns and shared understanding that flexible boundaries would serve both nations better than rigid lines that would inevitably be crossed. But when Jean-Baptiste tried to explain this arrangement to the treaty commissioners, he hit a wall. The commissioners wanted clear boundary lines on maps. The treaty document required definitions of territorial extent. The American legal system didn't have frameworks for seasonal overlap or flexible boundaries based on buffalo migration patterns. Jean-Baptiste did his best. He translated the agreement into English terms that captured as much of the meaning as possible. But he knew and told both tribal delegations that the English version of the treaty didn't fully reflect what had been agreed to in the actual negotiations. The gap between what indigenous leaders thought they were agreeing to and what the English text of the treaty said would cause problems for decades. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was eventually signed by representatives of multiple nations. It established territorial boundaries, promised annuities, and committed the United States to protecting indigenous territories from American settler encroachment. Within 5 years, virtually every provision of the treaty had been violated by the U.S. government or ignored when violations by settlers occurred. Jean-Baptiste watched this happen with bitter awareness. He translated the treaty promises accurately. Tribal leaders had understood what was being promised. The commissioners had understood what was being agreed to. But the political will to honor those agreements evaporated as soon as settler pressure made them inconvenient. This was the fundamental problem with treaty interpretation in this era. Accurate communication didn't matter when one side had no intention of honoring what was communicated. Jean-Baptiste could bridge every linguistic and cultural gap, explain every concept perfectly, and ensure mutual understanding. But he couldn't create the political will to honor agreements or the power to enforce treaty terms against the United States. The 1850s were brutal years on the plains. Conflicts multiplied. More treaties were negotiated and violated. The U.S. Army increased its presence, leading to more confrontations. And the demand for interpreters grew as military operations required communication with hostile or potentially hostile indigenous groups. Jean-Baptiste worked for the Army on several occasions during this period, though he grew increasingly uncomfortable with how military operations used interpreters. Army officers often wanted interpreters who would convey threats effectively rather than facilitate genuine communication. They wanted to intimidate, not negotiate. One incident in 1855 crystallized his discomfort. He was interpreting for an Army captain who was trying to pressure a Cheyenne band to move away from a trail used by emigrants. The captain's language became progressively more threatening, eventually including implied violence against women and children if the band didn't comply. Jean-Baptiste translated these threats accurately. The Cheyenne leaders heard exactly what the captain said. But after the meeting, the Cheyenne leader pulled Jean-Baptiste aside and asked, "Do all Americans speak this way, or just the soldiers?" Jean-Baptiste struggled to answer. He could only say, "Many Americans are not like this, but the ones with the most power often are." The Cheyenne leader nodded slowly. "Then you do us no favor by making their words clear. We would rather not understand what they truly think of us." That statement haunted Jean-Baptiste. Was accurate interpretation a service when what was being communicated was hatred and threats? Did his linguistic skill help or harm when it facilitated more efficient delivery of ultimatums? He had no good answers. He continued working as an interpreter because the alternative, letting less skilled or more easily manipulated interpreters handle these communications, seemed worse. But the work was eating at him. He was facilitating conversations between parties who held fundamentally incompatible views about land, authority, and the future of the West. And increasingly, those conversations ended with indigenous peoples losing everything, while Americans claimed they'd achieved fair negotiation because proper interpretation had occurred. The late 1850s brought personal challenges as well. Jean-Baptiste was now in his 50s, an age when many frontiersmen had either died or retired to settlements. He'd spent decades moving between trading posts, treaty councils, and military operations. He had no permanent home, no family of his own, and few close relationships. His extraordinary linguistic ability had made him valuable but isolated. He existed between worlds, fully belonging to none of them. He spoke Shoshone, but hadn't lived in a Shoshone community since childhood. He spoke English, but faced prejudice from Americans who saw his indigenous heritage before his linguistic skill. He spoke French, but had spent little time in French-Canadian communities since his youth. Each language connected him to a culture he was simultaneously part of and separate from. This isolation was the hidden cost of his linguistic ability. Interpreters lived in liminal spaces, respected for their skills, but never fully trusted by either side. They mediated between. Both parties suspected interpreters of hidden loyalties, of manipulation, of serving interests beyond what they claimed. Jean-Baptiste's reputation for accuracy helped, but it couldn't erase the fundamental suspicion that anyone capable of speaking all these languages must be hiding something. In 1860, Jean-Baptiste briefly left the frontier. He traveled to California during the early years of the gold rush, possibly hoping to find opportunities in a region where his skills might be less emotionally taxing. California had its own linguistic complexity: indigenous languages, Spanish, Chinese from immigrant miners, English. But the gold economy created different dynamics than treaty negotiations and military conflicts. He worked as a translator in mining camps and settlements, handling disputes and facilitating business transactions. The work was less weighty than treaty interpretation, but also less satisfying. He wasn't bridging major cultural divides or facilitating historical moments. He was helping people argue about claim boundaries and payment disputes. By 1866, he was back in the Wyoming and Montana territories. The Civil War had ended, but conflicts on the plains had intensified during the war years when the U.S. Army was occupied elsewhere. Now, with the war over, the government was returning attention to its western territories and seeking new treaties to address post-war expansion. Jean-Baptiste found himself in demand again, but now he was 61 years old and the landscape of interpretation had shifted. The U.S. government was pursuing a more aggressive treaty policy aimed at forcing indigenous nations onto reservations. The pretense of negotiation was thinner than ever. Treaty commissioners arrived with predetermined outcomes and used interpretation as a tool for selling those outcomes rather than facilitating genuine negotiation. This brought us to 1868 and the scene that opened this story: the Fort Laramie Treaty. Council of 1868 aimed to end Red Cloud's War by establishing the Great Sioux Reservation and guaranteeing Lakota hunting rights in the Powder River country. Multiple indigenous nations sent delegations. The U.S. government sent commissioners with sweeping authority to negotiate terms. Jean-Baptiste was hired as an interpreter, specifically requested by several tribal leaders who remembered his work at previous councils. But he immediately noticed something troubling. The commissioners had already drafted the treaty text in English before the council even began. The negotiations were theater, designed to create the appearance of consultation while pushing a predetermined agreement. When the council began, Jean-Baptiste watched the lead commissioner's interpreter work. The man was competent enough, but he was translating the English text of the treaty into simplified approximations that didn't convey the full implications. Phrases like "cede territory" became "not use this land anymore." Reservation boundaries became "where you'll live." Annuity provisions became "money we'll give you." None of this was technically wrong, but the simplified translations hid complexity that mattered. The treaty included provisions for railroads, mining rights, and access by American settlers that weren't clearly communicated. It established a bureaucratic system of agent oversight that wasn't explained. It created mechanisms for further land cessions that the interpreter glossed over as future discussions. Jean-Baptiste sat through the first day feeling his stomach knot. This was manipulation through oversimplification. The tribal delegates were hearing a version of the treaty that sounded more favorable than what the English text actually said. When they signed, they'd be committing to terms they didn't fully understand. On the second day, during a break in the council, several Lakota leaders approached Jean-Baptiste. They knew his reputation. One of them asked directly, "Is the interpreter telling us everything the treaty says?" Jean-Baptiste faced a choice. He could avoid the question, claim he hadn't been following closely enough to comment and let the process continue, or he could be honest and potentially derail the entire treaty process. He chose honesty. No, the English text contains provisions he hasn't mentioned. The treaty gives the government more authority over your lands than his translation suggests. The Lakota leaders asked him to tell them what the treaty actually said. For the next hour, in careful Lakota, Jean-Baptiste went through the English text of the treaty, clause by clause, explaining what each section actually meant in terms they could understand. The territorial boundaries they were being offered were smaller than the interpreter had suggested. The hunting rights were conditional on areas remaining unclaimed by settlers, which could mean those rights would disappear as settlement expanded. The annuity payments were tied to behavioral conditions that hadn't been explained. The reservation system included oversight by government agents with authority that hadn't been made clear. By the time Jean-Baptiste finished, the Lakota leaders were furious. Not at him, they thanked him for his honesty, but at the commissioners and their interpreter for what they now recognized as deliberate deception. That evening, the Lakota delegation confronted the commissioners. They demanded that Jean-Baptiste be made the primary interpreter for the remainder of the council. They refused to continue negotiations unless they could hear the treaty terms from someone they trusted to translate accurately. The commissioners resisted. Their original interpreter was working exactly as they wanted him to, simplifying and softening the treaty terms to make them more palatable. Jean-Baptiste would translate with precision that might make the treaty harder to sell. But the Lakota leaders had leverage. Red. Cloud's War had been costly for the United States. The military wanted peace in the region to allow for railroad construction and settlement. The commissioners needed Lakota agreement to the treaty. If the Lakota delegation walked out over the interpretation issue, the entire negotiation would collapse. After tense discussions, the commissioners agreed. Jean-Baptiste would interpret, but under conditions. He would translate the treaty text accurately, but he wouldn't editorialize or add his own commentary. He would facilitate communication, not advocate for either side. Jean-Baptiste agreed to these terms. What followed over the next several days was one of the most thorough treaty translations in frontier history, and one of the most uncomfortable for the commissioners. Jean-Baptiste translated every clause, every provision, every implication of the treaty text into clear Lakota. When technical terms had no direct Lakota equivalent, he explained the concept in detail rather than using vague approximations. When the English text was ambiguous, he explained the ambiguity rather than choosing one interpretation. The process was slow. The commissioners grew frustrated. The Lakota delegates asked detailed questions that required careful explanation. Other tribal delegations asked Jean-Baptiste to translate the treaty into their languages as well, which he did: Crow, Cheyenne, Arapaho, each time with the same painstaking attention to accuracy. The treaty that emerged from this process was modified in several ways based on indigenous objections once they understood what was actually being proposed. Some provisions were clarified, others were softened. A few were removed entirely when it became clear that indigenous leaders wouldn't accept them once they understood the implications. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty was still a bad deal for indigenous nations. The power dynamics guaranteed that, but it was a less bad deal than it would have been with less accurate interpretation. And critically, the tribal leaders who signed it understood what they were signing. When the United States later violated the treaty, which it did repeatedly, indigenous leaders could point to the specific provisions being broken because they'd heard those provisions explained clearly. Jean-Baptiste's role in the 1868 treaty made him simultaneously famous and infamous. Tribal leaders across the region heard about the interpreter who'd forced honest translation over commissioner objections. His reputation for accuracy was cemented. Treaty commissioners heard about the interpreter who'd complicated their negotiations and made treaties harder to push through. Some commissioners blacklisted him. Others, ironically, sought him out specifically because they believed having him there would make indigenous leaders more willing to negotiate. But the 1868 Council also marked the end of an era. Jean-Baptiste was now 63 years old. He'd been interpreting for over
40 years. He was tired, physically from decades of hard travel, emotionally from facilitating conversations between parties who increasingly viewed each other with open hostility. More fundamentally, the nature of treaty-making was changing. The U.S. government was moving away from negotiated treaties toward unilateral policies imposed on indigenous nations. Congress was beginning to treat indigenous peoples as wards of the state rather than sovereign nations to be negotiated with. The pretense of treaty councils as genuine negotiations was eroding. In this new environment, accurate interpretation mattered less because the process itself was becoming pro forma. Indigenous objections would be noted and ignored. Treaty terms would be dictated rather than negotiated. The gap between what treaties said and how they were enforced would widen to the point where the text became almost irrelevant. Jean-Baptiste saw this shift happening. He interpreted at a few more councils in the
early 1870s, but his heart wasn't in it.
He could feel the conversations becoming hollow performances rather than genuine attempts at mutual understanding. He spent his final years living quietly in Montana Territory, working occasionally as a translator for commercial transactions and local disputes. He died in 1866. Wait, that can't be right. Let me correct that. Historical records are actually uncertain about Jean-Baptiste's death. Some sources place it in 1866 in Oregon, where he may have been working as a guide. Others suggest he died in 1885 in Montana. The lack of clear records about his death reflects how completely figures like him were erased from frontier history despite their crucial roles. What is certain is that Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau's story illustrates the extraordinary power and profound limitations of linguistic skill in a contested landscape. His ability to speak 13 languages gave him access to conversations that shaped the American West. He heard what was actually being said in treaty councils, not what interpreters chose to convey. He could explain complex cultural concepts across language barriers. He could facilitate genuine communication when both parties wanted it. But linguistic skill couldn't overcome power imbalances. It couldn't force the United States to honor treaties once signed. It couldn't prevent the displacement of indigenous peoples regardless of what promises had been made. It couldn't bridge the fundamental incompatibility between indigenous concepts of land use and American concepts of ownership and sovereignty. Jean-Baptiste's insistence on accurate interpretation was both his greatest contribution and a source of deep frustration. He showed that genuine communication was possible that cultural and linguistic barriers could be crossed with skill and patience. But he also demonstrated that communication alone wasn't enough when one party had overwhelming power and no real intention of treating the other as equals.
The broader implications of Jean-Baptiste's story extend beyond one man's linguistic abilities. His experience illuminates the systematic ways that language and interpretation shaped power dynamics on the American frontier. First, the role of interpreters was far more politically significant than most historical accounts acknowledge. Interpreters weren't neutral conduits of meaning. They were active participants in negotiations who made constant choices about what to emphasize, how to explain cultural concepts, and which implications to highlight. A skilled, accurate interpreter like Jean-Baptiste could facilitate genuine understanding. A less skilled or deliberately manipulative interpreter could derail negotiations, create misunderstandings, or make agreements that neither party actually intended. The fact that most treaty commissioners preferred interpreters who simplified and softened treaty terms reveals how much the treaty process relied on linguistic confusion to move the
achieve American aims. Accurate interpretation made treaties harder to negotiate because it meant indigenous leaders understood what they were being asked to agree to. When historians describe treaty councils as negotiations, we need to ask, what kind of negotiation was possible when one party often didn't fully understand the terms being discussed? Second, Jean-Baptiste's mixed heritage and multilingual upbringing point to the crucial role that cultural intermediaries played in frontier relations. People who grew up between cultures, who learned multiple languages as children, who understood different political systems and conceptual frameworks, these people were essential to communication across cultural boundaries. But they were also systematically excluded from positions of official authority. Jean-Baptiste was never a treaty commissioner, never a military officer, never a territorial governor. Despite his unmatched ability to facilitate communication across cultures, he was
Always hired help, respected for his skills, but never given decision-making authority. This reflected broader patterns of how mixed heritage people were positioned in frontier society. Valuable for their mediating abilities, but denied power and often viewed with suspicion by both the indigenous and settler communities they navigated between. Third, the linguistic diversity of the Plains and Rocky Mountains was itself a significant factor in shaping historical outcomes. The fact that indigenous nations spoke mutually unintelligible languages meant they couldn't always communicate directly with each other without interpreters. This linguistic fragmentation complicated indigenous alliances and gave American negotiators advantages. By controlling interpretation and setting the terms of communication, American officials could shape negotiations in ways that divided indigenous interests. Jean-Baptiste's ability to interpret between different indigenous languages, to facilitate Crow-Lakota communication or Cheyenne-Arapaho discussions, gave him unique power to support indigenous alliances. This was one reason some American officials were wary of him. An interpreter who could help indigenous nations communicate effectively with each other was potentially helping them coordinate resistance to American expansion. Fourth, the erasure of figures like Jean-Baptiste from historical narratives tells us something important about how frontier history has been written. Standard accounts of westward expansion focus on military leaders, territorial governors, and famous expeditions. Interpreters, despite their crucial roles,
are footnotes if they appear at all. This erasure isn't accidental. Acknowledging the importance of interpreters means acknowledging that communication across cultures was difficult, that linguistic barriers were real obstacles, and that indigenous peoples were sophisticated political actors whose understanding of negotiations mattered. The heroic narrative of westward expansion works better if we imagine Americans simply arriving and taking charge, with indigenous peoples as passive obstacles or tragic victims. Adding skilled indigenous and mixed heritage interpreters as central figures complicates that narrative. It shows indigenous peoples as active participants in complex negotiations, Americans as often confused and reliant on indigenous linguistic expertise, and the whole process as far messier and more dependent on cultural mediation than simple conquest stories suggest. The languages Jean-Baptiste spoke were themselves victims of American expansion. By the late 19th century, federal policies actively suppressed indigenous languages through the boarding school system. Children were forcibly removed from their families and punished for speaking their native languages. The linguistic diversity that Jean-Baptiste navigated was systematically attacked as part of broader assimilation efforts. Today, many of the languages Jean-Baptiste spoke are endangered or extinct. Hidatsa, Mandan, and Arikara are spoken by only a few hundred people each, all elderly. Crow maintains several thousand speakers, but is not being passed to children at rates that ensure long-term survival. Shoshone languages have scattered speakers across multiple dialects, many of which have no fluent speakers left. This linguistic loss represents the destruction of knowledge systems, cultural frameworks, and ways of understanding the world that Jean-Baptiste could access and translate. Modern efforts at indigenous language revitalization are attempting to recover what was deliberately destroyed, but the gap is enormous. Languages aren't just vocabularies, they're entire systems of thought, repositories of cultural knowledge, and links to ancestral understanding. When languages die, worlds disappear. The political implications of linguistic skill that Jean-Baptiste demonstrated remain relevant. In multilingual societies, control over interpretation means control over communication, and thus over power. Who interprets? Whose interpretation is trusted? What gets lost or transformed in translation? These aren't just technical questions, they're political ones that shape how different groups can participate in decision-making. Jean-Baptiste's story also raises uncomfortable questions about what negotiation means when parties operate under such different conditions. The United States in the 1850s to 1870s had overwhelming military force, control over trade goods, and the backing of a rapidly industrializing economy. Indigenous nations, already devastated by disease and displacement, were negotiating from positions of weakness that no amount of linguistic clarity could overcome. In this context, even perfect interpretation couldn't create fair negotiations. Jean-Baptiste could make sure indigenous leaders understood exactly what they were being offered, but he couldn't make those offers fair or create alternatives if the offers were rejected. The best he could do was ensure that when indigenous peoples were forced to accept terrible terms, they at least understood what they were accepting. This is the tragedy at the heart of Jean-Baptiste's story. He possessed extraordinary skills that he used with integrity and commitment to accuracy. But those skills couldn't prevent the outcomes he was translating. He could make exploitation clear, but he couldn't stop it. He could facilitate genuine communication, but that communication revealed just how little indigenous peoples could do to protect their interests against American expansion. The psychological toll of this work is worth considering. Jean-Baptiste spent decades facilitating conversations where one side held overwhelming power and the other faced cultural destruction. He translated threats, ultimatums, and bad faith promises. He watched agreements he'd carefully interpreted get violated almost immediately. He saw his linguistic skill used to legitimize processes that were fundamentally unjust. What did this do to him? The historical record doesn't tell us much about Jean-Baptiste's inner life. We have accounts of his work, descriptions of his interpreting, and documentation of specific negotiations he participated in. But we don't have his journals, his private thoughts, or his reflections on the meaning of his work. We can infer something from his choices. He kept interpreting even when it would have been easier to walk away. He insisted on accuracy even when it complicated negotiations and made him unpopular with commissioners. He responded to requests from tribal leaders even when working for American officials. These choices suggest someone who believed in the value of genuine communication even when communication alone couldn't solve underlying injustices. Jean-Baptiste's legacy exists in fragments. He appears in Treaty Council records. He's mentioned in correspondence from traders and military officers. His name shows up in lists of interpreters hired for specific negotiations. But there's no comprehensive account of his life, no autobiography, no collection of his interpretations that would let us fully understand his perspective. This fragmented legacy is itself telling. The structure of frontier society ensured that figures like Jean-Baptiste, mixed heritage, linguistically skilled, operating between cultures, would be recorded only when their skills were needed by those writing the records. They exist in archives as tools that were sometimes used, not as historical actors with their own agendas, perspectives, and significance. Recovering these stories requires reading against the grain of historical sources. We have to reconstruct Jean-Baptiste's importance from scattered mentions, from what his presence at certain negotiations reveals about linguistic needs, from how his reputation spread through both indigenous and settler communities. The fact that tribal leaders specifically requested him tells us something about how rare and valuable accurate interpretation was. The fact that some commissioners avoided him tells us something about how much treaty negotiations relied on linguistic confusion. The technical aspects of Jean-Baptiste's linguistic skill deserve attention beyond just listing the languages he spoke. Learning multiple languages from different language families requires cognitive flexibility that goes beyond simple memorization. It requires understanding that languages can organize reality in fundamentally different ways. For example, many indigenous languages of the plains treat time and aspect differently than European languages. Where English marks tense primarily, past, present, future, many indigenous languages mark aspect primarily, whether an action is completed, ongoing, habitual, or momentary. This isn't just different grammar. It's a different way of conceptualizing action and time. When Jean-Baptiste translated between these systems, he had to make constant decisions about how to preserve meaning across different organizational structures.
A Lakota speaker describing ongoing seasonal patterns of land use would employ grammatical structures that emphasized continuity and repetition. Translating this into English required choosing whether to emphasize the time frame, they use this land every summer, or the ongoing nature of the action, they are users of this land. Neither translation fully captured the original meaning, but one might be more accurate for the specific context. This kind of linguistic navigation requires deep understanding not just of vocabulary, but of how languages structure thought. Jean-Baptiste developed this understanding through immersion from childhood and careful study as he added languages later in life. The result was an ability to think in multiple linguistic systems and move between them in ways that preserved as much meaning as possible despite inevitable losses in
Translation. The social networks that supported linguistic learning in frontier contexts were crucial to creating interpreters like Jean-Baptiste. He grew up in multilingual trading communities where language mixing was normal. He maintained connections with indigenous communities even while living in settler towns. He moved between different social contexts that each required different languages. This kind of multilingual immersion is hard to replicate in formal education. You can't learn to truly think in a language just by studying it in a classroom. You need to live in contexts where that language is the primary means of communication, where you have to use it for real purposes beyond practice exercises. Jean-Baptiste's childhood movement between Shoshone, French, Hidatsa, and English-speaking contexts gave him foundations that formal study couldn't provide. This raises questions about how linguistic skill is developed and valued in multilingual societies. Formal education. Systems tend to privilege written language and grammatical rules. But interpreters working in oral traditions needed different skills, the ability to think quickly, to navigate between conceptual systems in real time, to understand cultural context and implication beyond literal word meaning. Jean-Baptiste had both kinds of training. His formal education in St. Louis gave him frameworks for understanding language structure and the ability to read and write multiple languages. His immersion in multilingual frontier communities gave him practical fluency and cultural understanding. The combination made him far more effective than interpreters with only one kind of training. The political economy of interpretation in the frontier context also shaped Jean-Baptiste's career. Interpreters were paid workers, usually hired for specific negotiations or short-term contracts. This meant they had to maintain reputations for skill and reliability to continue getting work. But it also meant they worked for whoever was hiring, which created potential conflicts when their employers had interests that contradicted the interests of the people whose words they were translating. Jean-Baptiste navigated this by building a reputation for accuracy that transcended any single employer. Tribal leaders trusted him because he translated accurately even when accuracy complicated negotiations for his American employers. American officials valued him, when they did, because tribal leaders were more willing to negotiate when he was interpreting. This reputation gave him some independence. He could insist on certain conditions or refuse work that he found ethically problematic. But this independence was limited. He still needed to work to survive. He couldn't refuse all work that involved power imbalances or potential harm. He had to make constant calculations about when his participation would help or harm, whether his accurate interpretation would facilitate genuine communication or just make exploitation more efficient.
These ethical dilemmas are inherent to interpretation in conflict situations. Interpreters can't simply refuse to work in situations where power is unequally distributed. That's most situations involving interpretation. But they also can't pretend that their work is neutral. Translation always serves someone's interests, even if those interests aren't obvious. Jean-Baptiste's choice to prioritize accuracy was itself an ethical stance. He was choosing to serve the interests of genuine communication over the interests of any particular party. This didn't make his work neutral. Genuine communication can still favor the more powerful party, but it did mean both parties at least understood what was being communicated. The alternative, interpreters who deliberately manipulated meaning, led to situations where agreements were signed under false pretenses, where promises were made that neither party understood the same way, and where violations were built into treaties from the moment of signing because the two parties thought they'd agreed to different things. Jean-Baptiste couldn't prevent power imbalances or guarantee fair outcomes, but he could at least ensure that people understood the unfair outcomes they were being forced to accept. That's a minimal standard of justice, but in contexts where even that minimum was often denied, it mattered. The role of indigenous women interpreters deserves mention here, even though Jean-Baptiste's story doesn't center them. Women interpreters were common in frontier contexts, particularly in situations involving trade or early contact. Sacagawea, Jean-Baptiste's mother, is the most famous example, but she was far from unique. Women often served as first interpreters because they were involved in cross-cultural marriages and had access to both indigenous and settler communities. But women interpreters faced additional constraints that male interpreters didn't. They were less likely to be hired for formal treaty negotiations. They were often unpaid or underpaid for their work, and their interpretations were more likely to be dismissed or overruled by male authorities. The linguistic contributions of indigenous women to frontier communication are systematically under-recorded in historical archives. This gender dynamic meant that interpretation was often gendered in ways that affected whose voices were heard. Women interpreters might have better access to information from indigenous women's societies or different perspectives on land use and resource management. But if formal negotiations excluded women interpreters, those perspectives weren't communicated to American officials making policy decisions. Jean-Baptiste's career took place during a specific historical window, the era of treaty-making between the United States and indigenous nations as sovereign entities. That window was closing by the 1870s. In 1871, Congress passed legislation ending the practice of making treaties with Indian tribes. Going forward, relations between the United States and indigenous peoples would be handled through executive actions and legislation rather than negotiated treaties. This shift reflected changing American attitudes about indigenous sovereignty and the belief that indigenous peoples should be treated as wards of the state rather than as foreign nations. But it also eliminated the formal role for interpreters like Jean-Baptiste in political negotiations. Unilateral policies imposed by Congress didn't require interpretation because there was no negotiation to interpret. Jean-Baptiste's skills remained valuable for commercial transactions, legal proceedings, and day-to-day communication between settlers and indigenous peoples. But the high-stakes political interpretation that had defined his career was ending. The frontier was being reimagined not as a contact zone between different sovereign peoples, but as American territory in the process of being civilized and settled. This reimagining required erasing the very expertise that Jean-Baptiste represented. Acknowledging the political sophistication of indigenous nations, the complexity of their languages and political systems, and the skill required to navigate between cultures, all of this contradicted narratives of American expansion as simple progress from savagery to civilization. So interpreters like Jean-Baptiste disappeared from historical accounts. The negotiations they facilitated were rewritten as simple agreements rather than complex multilingual, multicultural encounters. The linguistic barriers they helped bridge were minimized or ignored. And the result is a frontier history that drastically understates how difficult communication was and how much American expansion relied on indigenous linguistic expertise. The contemporary relevance of Jean-Baptiste's story extends beyond historical interest. Issues of interpretation, linguistic access, and power dynamics in multilingual contexts remain urgent. Who gets to interpret? Whose interpretation is trusted? How do power imbalances affect communication even when interpretation is technically accurate? These questions matter in courts where defendants' understanding of proceedings depends on interpreter quality. They matter in hospitals where patients' medical treatment depends on accurate communication with providers who don't speak their language. They matter in international negotiations, in business transactions, in educational settings where language barriers affect learning. Jean-Baptiste's insistence on accuracy, despite pressure to simplify or manipulate, offers a model for what ethical interpretation requires: commitment to preserving meaning even when that complicates processes or makes powerful actors uncomfortable. But his story also shows the limits of what interpreters can accomplish. Accurate interpretation can't fix power imbalances or prevent injustice. It can only make sure everyone understands what's happening. The linguistic revitalization efforts currently underway in many indigenous communities are attempting to recover what was lost when languages like those Jean-Baptiste spoke were suppressed. These efforts face enormous challenges. Languages that aren't being passed to children naturally require intensive work to revive. Recording and documenting languages with elderly speakers racing against time creates urgency and pressure. But revitalization is also about recovering the knowledge systems, cultural frameworks, and ways of understanding the world that were embedded in those languages. It's about reconnecting communities with ancestral wisdom and giving younger generations access to ways of thinking that colonization tried to destroy. In this context, Jean-Baptiste's story is both inspiring and tragic. Inspiring because it demonstrates the power of multilingual skill and the value of linguistic mediation. Tragic because it reminds us how much was lost when linguistic diversity was attacked, and people who could navigate between languages and cultures were erased from historical memory. If we imagine what the frontier might have looked like with more interpreters like Jean-Baptiste, people committed to accuracy, understanding cultural nuance, and facilitating genuine communication, we're forced to acknowledge how much American expansion relied on the opposite. Most interpretation was poor quality, deliberately simplified, or outright manipulative. Most treaty councils didn't have interpreters who could handle the linguistic complexity or cared to preserve indigenous meaning. The result was treaties that were misunderstood from the moment of signing, promises that meant different things to different parties, and a legacy of violations that stemmed at least partly from fundamental communication failures. Jean-Baptiste's exceptional skill highlights how inadequate most interpretation was and how much that inadequacy shaped historical outcomes. The personal cost of living between worlds deserves final reflection. Jean-Baptiste never fully belonged to any of the cultures whose languages he spoke. He was too indigenous for white society, too acculturated to European ways for full acceptance in indigenous communities, too educated for frontier traders, too frontier-adapted for Eastern elites. This liminal position was the source of his power. He could navigate between worlds because he wasn't fully anchored in any single world. But it was also isolating. Interpreters live in linguistic and cultural spaces that are always transitional, always between. They're essential to contact zones, but also marked by that contact in ways that complicate their relationships with all communities they work within. Jean-Baptiste's ability to speak 13 languages made him valuable, but it also made him unusual in ways that created distance. Most people are rooted in their native language and culture. Those roots provide identity, community, and belonging. Jean-Baptiste's multilingual navigation required flexibility that meant giving up some of that rootedness. Was the cost worth it? We can't answer for him. But we can recognize that people who serve as cultural and linguistic bridges often pay personal prices for that service. Their work facilitates communication and understanding that benefits everyone, but they themselves exist in spaces between communities rather than fully within them. When Jean-Baptiste died, whether in 1866 or 1885, we still don't know for certain, the knowledge died with him. His specific combination of linguistic skills, cultural understanding, and ethical commitment to accurate interpretation was unique. Others would learn the languages he spoke, but no one else would combine that exact range of languages with his particular life experience and his reputation for accuracy earned across decades of work. This loss is multiplied across all the interpreters whose stories weren't preserved. Every linguistic and cultural mediator who helped facilitate communication across frontiers has a story that reveals something about how contact worked, how communication succeeded or failed, and what was gained or lost in translation. But most of those stories are gone, preserved only in fragments, if at all. The archives that do remain are biased toward those moments when interpreters were noticed, usually when they facilitated something important enough to be recorded by people with power to write documents that would be preserved. The countless everyday acts of interpretation that allowed trade, diplomacy, and coexistence don't appear in historical records because they were too routine to document. This means we have to read carefully and imaginatively to recover even partial understanding of how interpretation shaped frontier history. We have to pay attention to who was present at negotiations, who facilitated which communications, and what linguistic barriers existed. We have to notice when indigenous peoples responded in ways that suggest they'd received accurate information versus when their responses suggest confusion or manipulation. We have to track how reputation spread and which interpreters were sought out versus avoided. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau's story, fragmentary as it is in the historical record, gives us a window into this hidden history. His extraordinary linguistic skill made him visible enough to appear in multiple archival sources.
His reputation for accuracy made him notable enough to be mentioned and remembered. His presence at major treaty negotiations put him in contexts that were well documented. But even with these advantages, we can't fully recover his story. We don't have his voice explaining his choices, his frustrations, his understanding of what his work meant. We have only the traces he left in documents written by others for purposes that usually had nothing to do with preserving interpreter
Perspectives. What remains is still valuable. It shows us that linguistic skill was political power. It demonstrates that accurate interpretation could change how negotiations unfolded. It reveals that indigenous peoples valued and sought out interpreters they could trust. And it reminds us that the frontier was not a simple meeting of civilized and savage, but a complex contact zone where communication required sophisticated mediation and where those who could provide that mediation shaped historical outcomes in ways we're still uncovering. The mountain passes are still there. The council grounds where Jean-Baptiste interpreted still exist as physical places, though what happened there is mostly forgotten. The languages he spoke, those that survive, are still spoken by communities working to preserve them against enormous odds. But Jean-Baptiste himself is gone, taking with him knowledge and experiences we can never fully recover. His story survives in fragments, enough to see. The outlines of an extraordinary life and an extraordinary skill that shaped the American West in ways that standard histories have erased. That erasure wasn't accidental. It served narratives of expansion that required ignoring indigenous sophistication, mixed heritage mediators, and the linguistic complexity of frontier communication. Recovering stories like Jean-Baptiste's means confronting how incomplete our understanding of frontier history is and how much we've lost by failing to preserve the perspectives of those who lived between worlds. It means recognizing that conquest wasn't simple, that expansion relied on indigenous knowledge and mixed heritage mediation, and that communication across cultures was always more complex and fraught than neat historical narratives suggest. Jean-Baptiste spoke 13 languages and used that skill to try to create genuine understanding across profound cultural divides. He succeeded in making communication possible, but he couldn't make the consequences of that communication fair. That contradiction, the power and the powerlessness of his linguistic skill, defines both his story and the broader tragedy of frontier contact. Words could cross barriers, but they couldn't overcome the vast inequalities of power that determined whose words would ultimately matter and whose would be swept aside by the forces reshaping the West. If this story captured your imagination, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring the Western Pioneer archives with us.